Thank you so much for tuning in and welcome to Serve's podcast series. The podcasts are brought to you by Serve at UNC Greensboro. We are a university-based center with over 3 decades of experience working with educators and policymakers to improve education. These podcasts highlight conversations on various topics ranging from early childhood education to high school reform with a lens on equity. My name is Sana Silvera Roy, a communications specialist at Serve. All podcasts will be archived and found on Serve's website, serve.org. Today's podcast will conclude Serve's 3-part series on early college high schools and the impact on post-secondary outcomes. The discussions are led by Dr. Julie Edmunds, the director of the Early College Research Center at UNC Greensboro, and Matt Bristow-Smith, the principal at Edgecombe Early College High School. In episode 1, Matt and Julie offered an introductory insight into early college high schools discussing research, implementation, and equity practices that are in place to increase students' success. In episode 2, Julie and Matt continued that discussion with insights into supports needed for positive student impact in early college high schools. In today's episode, Julie and Matt will round out the discussions with lessons learned from implementing early college high schools. Each episode is a conversation between Julie and Matt, who offer their perspectives from the research side and the practitioner side of early college high schools. Please take a listen.
If you think about early colleges, as we've been talking about, really strong model of schooling. But at this point, it serves a minority of students, very small proportion of students. And I think one of the big questions that people are sort of struggling with right now is how do you take the lessons learned from the early college and apply those in comprehensive high schools? How does it help you think differently about comprehensive high schools? I will say one of the strengths of the early college feels like this is people thinking about if every kid in a high school were expected to go to college and were expected to be successful in college, what does the high school environment need to look like in order to make that happen? And so the early college is kind of this test case of essentially, number one, can we design a school that makes sure and prepares every student for college? And then second, it's actually a test case of can we combine high school and college at the same time? And what we're seeing is that, yes, we in fact can do that and we can be successful at it. So Matt, if you were going to think about sort of lessons learned from your school that comprehensive high schools could apply and where comprehensive high schools could start moving in the direction of looking more like an early college, what would you think about? What are some of those lessons from your perspective?
So first, I would emphasize that every school at every level should always be asking themselves, what are the barriers that are existing in our system that may interfere with students reaching their potential? And so that may be whether students are taking honors classes or not. That may be whether students are taking college classes or not. It may be, what are the barriers that are existing within my system that are keeping students from becoming their full selves? And early colleges, I do think, are uniquely positioned to look at their systems and to design those systems around students. So often, traditional schools are designed around the system. They're designed around the adults. They're designed around schedules. They're designed around almost everything except for the student. And so I would initially, my first thought is, Julie, schools need to think more and more about how can we be student-centered? How can we be family-centered? And how can we design our systems specifically to meet the unique opportunity and potential and individuality that each student brings to the table? So I think that's first. I think the second piece that really comes to mind when I'm thinking about lessons learned from early colleges is how can we provide ongoing supports from 9th grade to graduation that meet the needs and opportunities of students as they grow and as they develop. So if a student is ready for an additional challenge in 9th grade to take, for example, their first college class, why can't they do that in a traditional school environment? Why do they have to attend an early college to be able to do that? And I think that's something I think is also key is, let's nurture and create opportunities for students as early as we possibly can when they're in high school so that they can then grow, explore, get to know themselves, feel challenged, and figure out who they are while they're in high school before they take that big leap to going into what comes next after high school. So generally, opportunities for self-exploration, opportunities to differentiate or to personalize the learning experience. Certainly, schools need to do a better job building relationships just at every level with students of all colors, with students of all backgrounds. Early colleges describe themselves as families because that's how we think of ourselves. If a traditional school thought of itself as a family, what would they do differently when it comes to meeting the needs of their kids? At our school, we're aware of the importance of certain key turning points in a kid's high school career. For example, we're really aware that the transition into high school is critical for students. And all the data bears that out, that students that fail a class their freshman year are more likely to drop out of school. And so one of the lessons learned for us has been the better we help students to transition into high school, the earlier that they are successful and the more likely we are to keep them being successful. There's also that transition into taking their first college class. This is something that's new. This is something that's different for them. This is a big leap. We provide them support there. When we think about the ACT, which is the statewide college readiness assessment that we do in North Carolina, many traditional schools just administer the test. We spend some significant focused time helping students to prepare not just learning content, but also learning strategies for the ACT. We want students who take this college readiness test, if they're in an environment that's preparing them for college, to have had some significant support there. And then when they graduate, I would like to emphasize that we make sure that every one of our students who is eligible completes the FAFSA, the free application for federal student aid. It's part of our experience in their final year. So every one of our students applies for college because it's baked into our system. Every student completes the FAFSA, and our counselor monitors FAFSA completion using a dashboard that's been set up by NCSEAA. This FAFSA dashboard allows our students to have a school advocate who provides them support. So if they get caught up in the FAFSA process and their application for some reason doesn't get completed, someone at school knows who can then provide an intervention. And so one of the things I think a traditional school system can learn from early colleges is about focusing on some of those key points in a high school student's matriculation, the onboarding in ninth grade, preparing for the ACT, the FAFSA as a way of setting students up, not just to apply and get accepted to college, but also to pay for it. Those are key services that help kids to generally get a little bit more value out of their high school experience. And I don't think that that would be a heavy lift for most school systems to look at what do we do to onboard our ninth graders? What do we do with our 11th graders to prepare them for the ACT? And then what do we do to make sure that each and every student at our school completes the FAFSA?
Matt keeps using the term baked into the system. Matt was talking about before. That's a point where students can fall off whatever the trajectory is, because anytime there's a transition point, that creates a gap or an opportunity for students to kind of fall through. And so I think what the early college is doing that's very different from the current system is it's saying, let's try to get rid of that gap as much as possible. And so while we've got the students, so while we have control over these students right now, which is when they're going to high school, which is something that everyone's expected to do, let's make sure that we also give them access and allow them to be successful at attaining some sort of a post-secondary credential, so that that's part of that system, so that you're getting rid of that gap where a lot of students can fall off. And you're saying, yeah, let's create a system where they're essentially expected to get some sort of a post-secondary credential. And that feels very important for us today, particularly in this society, because we know that the economic system in the U.S. depends more and more on students having some sort of post-secondary credential, right? And so if we have this economic system that has that depends on that, then what we should have is an educational system that makes it easier for students to get those sorts of post-secondary credentials that our economic system requires. And we don't have that right now. Right now, we've got these separate systems where, again, students can fall off the pipeline in lots of different places. And it feels like our current system is set up, and I think you talked about this earlier too, Matt, our current system is really set up to really exacerbate the gaps that we have, because we've got this growing expectation for more students to get post-secondary education, but that's significantly harder for certain groups of students. So those groups of students, for whom it's significantly harder to access post-secondary education are really going to be suffering with the economy, and those gaps are going to just continue to grow larger and larger and larger.
When I was in the classroom, I used to build my lesson plans around the one student in the room that was hard to reach. And I knew that if I could engage that one student, that the design of the lesson plan would typically reach each and every student in the room. And I think schools that early colleges that are focused on first generation students, who are focused on students that are potential dropouts or students that need acceleration, are well positioned to try to meet the needs of all students at their school.
When the early college was first started in North Carolina, it really had that emphasis on the transfer to a 4-year and getting those associate degree credits. And we talked to some students who were finishing up and graduating from the early college, but had decided not to go on to a 4-year. We were interested in that particular population because we're like, okay, so this is probably the best college transition program on the planet, and you're still making a decision not to go on to a 4-year. So what's going on there? And for some of those students, they really didn't want to go on. Some of them were tired and they wanted a break. But for some of them, they had learned that they didn't want to go on, that more 4-year was not for them. And they really wish that they had had that opportunity to get CTE credentials.
A couple of years ago, our valedictorian at our school, female student, graduated with her Associate of Sciences and a welding certificate. She went to NC State to study in their solar panels and engineering program. This year, we graduated multiple female students with welding certificates. And I like that. When we think about equity, we sometimes kind of focus on racial equity, but when we think about gender equity, it is really powerful when you have a school environment where girls feel safe to explore professions and explore experiences, whether that's through an internship or a senior project or taking a CTE course that they might not otherwise do in a traditional environment that may not have a pathway or an opportunity, access, or support for that.
That more of those schools, early colleges, are starting to expand opportunities to students to look more like yours so that they have the opportunity to earn those terminal CTE credentials as well. So if they don't want to go on to a 4-year, they're able to then earn something that still will allow them to get the training that they need to get a decent paying job. And I think what we will need to see moving forward, if we really want to expand this, is, again, more of those opportunities for students to earn those CTE credentials, those terminal credentials, whether that's cosmetology, whether it's welding, as you're talking about, whether it's HVAC, whether it's plumbing, whether it's electrician's credentials. The opportunity to earn those credentials while they're still in high school, I think, is definitely a way that the early college can expand its.
Yeah, totally agree on that. And Julie, interesting research question for you guys to possibly pursue moving down the road. I know that from the pandemic, one of the lessons that we learned from the pandemic was that a number of the students that were in their final year with us found themselves working jobs because they were in positions in their family in terms of generational wealth or lack thereof. These young people needed to become self-sufficient as soon as possible in order to remove their financial burden on their family. It would be interesting moving forward to see how many students moving through the early college model are graduating with certificates or credentials that allow them to get into the workforce earlier so that they can begin to be financially independent with an eye towards like family wealth or generational poverty. Because that is something that we do hear as a theme from a number of our students is my parents can't afford for me to go to college. My parents can barely afford to feed me right now. And so I want to get a good paying job as soon as possible. And increasingly, what we hear from a lot of employers is they want graduates or they want candidates applying for their jobs who know themselves, have already developed some of those soft skills and that sense of personal responsibility and internal motivation and drive so that they can do the training. This is really a message to policymakers who might be listening to our podcast. Sometimes we hear discussions about the cost of running early colleges, that early colleges are small, that they don't have a large scale to them, that the number of students that we serve is fewer than the numbers of students served by traditional schools. And so there's this emphasis on cost and what do early colleges cost on a per student basis? What do they cost to operate? The thing I would like to pivot towards is to think about the value of early colleges, to shift the conversation from cost to value. And Julie's research, I think, will bear out that the value of an early college education is worth every single dollar that we invest in it in terms of student outcomes and in terms of student ability to be contributing members of society. And that's the piece that I know so often as we're thinking about where do we spend our very limited education budgets, how do we spend our education dollars? Is it worth creating an innovative model that may serve fewer students than a large high school that may serve thousands? I would emphasize that there's a real value to that. And especially that value may be more to the first generation college student or to the student who might be a potential dropout. And so that's a piece of the discussion today that we haven't quite spent time on, that I want to emphasize is I believe there is incredible value in running early colleges that create a seamless opportunity for students to both get a high school diploma and an associate's or CTE credential, in preparing them for a world that is, as I shared earlier, is continuing to evolve.
I think one of the challenges with early college in general is that when you think about comparing it to something, the comparison isn't that clear. And so when we're talking about comparing costs, for example, if you compare the costs of an early college to the cost of a student in a comprehensive high school, there is actually a slightly higher cost for the early college than a student in a comprehensive high school. But what you have to remember is that high school and college are happening at the same time. So it's not like that's actually a fair comparison. So it's not necessarily a fair comparison to say, okay, well, it costs this much to educate a student in comprehensive high school and it costs this much to educate a student in an early college. So what we started doing is looking at the cost to different points on the educational continuum. And so we said, okay, what does it cost to get a student a high school diploma? What does it cost to get a student an associate degree? What does it cost a student to get a bachelor's degree? And when we looked at cost, it was the cost to society. So what does it just cost? No matter who's paying it, whether it's a student paying it or the taxpayer paying it, no matter what. And what we found is that if you stop at a high school credential, it's going to cost the early college route as compared to the traditional route. It's going to cost more to get a student just to a high school credential. If you look at getting an associate degree, it's actually slightly cheaper to do it through the early college route than it is to do it through the traditional route. And then if you look at getting a bachelor's degree, it's substantially cheaper to get a bachelor's degree through the early college route than it is to get it through the traditional route. So part of our problem in our discussions about cost is that we're thinking in this old school sort of fragmented budget where we're thinking about the K-12 budget, which is separate from the post-secondary budget, et cetera. But if policymakers really thought holistically about cost and thought about the costs for everything all the way to these different credentials, then the early college route is actually a more cost-effective way to educate students. So I think I would encourage people to start thinking about cost much more holistically. So it's not just about sort of the high school portion of it, because again, early college is not just a high school. It's high school and college happening at the same time. And I think we need to push policymakers to recognize that this is actually a different paradigm for education. And so again, when you're making those comparisons, you can't think the regular high school and the early college comparison is not the one that we should be making. The other thing in our research, what we have found is that on average, early colleges actually cost districts less than a comprehensive high school costs a district. Now, the additional costs are coming from the post-secondary institutions.
Something else I'd like to share. And first and foremost, I would say that the fundamental belief at our school, which we mentioned earlier today, is that all students belong to all teachers. And so there's nobody at our school who says or believes, like, I'm only teaching my kids. We're all teaching everybody's students, because that's kind of how we operate. It is built into my role as instructional leader. And then the second piece I was about to share is that it's the culture of our school. The culture is bigger than any one of us. The culture exists when a new teacher comes in. That teacher is joining the culture of the school. And the culture isn't about making all teachers the same. It's about capitalizing upon their individual strengths and bringing them together so that they contribute to the whole, to the sum is greater than the individual parts of the school. So culture is important. Teacher assets are important. Opportunities to collaborate are important. Me being instructional leader is important. And that's keeping our eyes on the prize and knowing what it is we're actually trying to accomplish each day in the classroom.
This will conclude our 3-part series on early college high schools. A special thank you to Dr. Julie Edmunds and Matt Bristow-Smith for sharing their expertise with us throughout the series. To learn more about them and their work, be sure to visit the show notes at serve.org. In the meantime, from all of us here at Serve to all of you, thank you for spending this time with us. Until next time.